A cold wind swept across the wide plains that evening, carrying with it the dry scent of dust, cedar smoke, and something older that men of the frontier never tried to name. Far out where the land rolled into quiet hills, a lone cabin stood against the fading sky. Its windows glowed faintly, the only sign that someone still lived in that forgotten stretch. Folks in town had their own stories about the man who stayed out there, calling him everything from a broken soul to a ghost wandering on borrowed time. But none of them truly knew him or the weight he carried. The rancher's name was Hawk, broad-shouldered. Weather-hardened, with a silence that could fill a room. He lived alone by choice, or at least that was what he let others believe. Years ago he had built that cabin with his own hands, raised those fences, dug those wells, and nursed more cattle back to life than he could count. Yet for all the strength in him, something inside had gone empty. He had buried that part deep, the way a man buries a secret beneath the soil, hoping it never rises again. Every morning, Hawk saddled his old bay horse and rode across the land he fought so hard to keep. The sun burned through the chill as he checked his herds, mended broken wire, and kept watch for mountain lions drifting too close. It was the same routine he followed year after year, steady as the ticking of a clock he no longer wound. His life had become a long stretch of quiet days and colder nights, with nothing but coyotes howling in the darkness to keep him company. Even the sound of his own voice felt strange sometimes, like it came from a man he barely recognized. People didn't journey out to Hawk's place unless trouble forced them. The distance alone was enough to turn most riders back. The town was 30 miles away, and the trail to his ranch ran through jagged ravines where the wind seemed to whisper warnings. Despite that, rumors drifted in whenever he made his rare supply run. Some whispered that Hawk was cursed. Others said he guarded something valuable or dangerous. A few believed he was simply waiting for something, though none could agree on what that something might be. Hawk never corrected them. Let folks talk. Their stories kept them at a safe distance, and distance was all he wanted. Connection had once brought him hope, but it had destroyed pieces of his life he didn't know how to rebuild. And so he chose to remain alone, letting the land and cattle be enough. But the land held its own truth. A man might think he chooses solitude, but the land knows when a heart has grown tired of carrying its own weight. It waits for the moment something unexpected arrives to shift the wind. That shift came on a late autumn afternoon when the sky hung low and gray. Hawk had just finished unloading sacks of feed when his horse pricked its ears toward the road. The land was still, too still, the kind of quiet that made a man grip the handle of his rifle without thinking. He stepped onto his porch and narrowed his eyes at the long trail cutting through the plains. A wagon wasn't common out this direction. A stranger was even less common, he saw it then. A small wagon pulled by a single mule, bouncing and swaying as it fought through the rough ground. Someone sat at the front, hunched beneath a worn coat, guiding the reins with slow, steady hands. Hawk felt a strange tightening in his chest. He didn't expect company, and nobody told him they were coming. The mail riders never traveled that far, and the cattle buyers always sent word ahead. Whoever this was, they weren't part of his world. As the wagon grew closer, he noticed small details first. The old wood repaired many times. The faded blanket draped over the traveler's knees. The way the figure held their backs straight despite the cold. Something dignified rested in their posture, something that didn't match the rough coat or dust-covered boots. Hawk felt the air change around him, as if the land itself recognized the approaching presence. The wagon rolled to a stop near his porch. The traveler climbed down slowly, boots touching the ground with careful control. When the coat shifted, Hawk saw long black hair braided with simple tribal beads. His grip on the rifle eased with surprise. The stranger wasn't what he expected. Their features carried the sharp, proud strength of Apache bloodlines, yet there was no weapon at their side, no threat in their stance. Instead, the traveler reached into the wagon and pulled out a bundle wrapped in leather. Holding it the way someone might hold an important document, Hawk stepped forward. His voice came out deep and rough, unused to speaking to anyone but the wind. He asked their name and purpose, but the traveler didn't answer right away. They studied him with calm, steady eyes that seemed to weigh everything about him in a single breath. Something about their gaze unsettled him, not because it was cold, but because it wasn't. It felt like they were seeing the man he once was, rather than the one he had forced himself to become. Finally, the traveler handed him the bundle. Hawk hesitated before unwrapping it. Inside was a sealed envelope bearing official markings he hadn't seen in years. His breath hitched. The wax symbol wasn't local. It belonged to a distant agency tied to old agreements and border negotiations. One Hawk thought had long forgotten men like him. The traveler spoke then, their voice low but clear. They told him they were sent as a mail order arrival, assigned for reasons written inside that envelope. Hawk's mind froze. A mail order what? People wrote for goods or tools, but a person wasn't something a man like him ordered. Before he could speak, the traveler added something that chilled him deeper than the autumn wind. They said Hawk's name had been on the registry for years, and a request tied to his ranch had finally been activated. Hawk felt the world tilt. He hadn't signed anything. He hadn't asked for anything. And yet that envelope, heavy in his hand, claimed otherwise. The traveler watched him, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to open the letter that might change everything about his quiet life. The mule snorted behind them. The wind rustled through the dry grass. Even the land seemed to hold its breath. Hawk didn't know what lay inside that envelope, or why fate had chosen that moment to deliver a stranger to his door. But one truth settled over him like a weight. His years of silence were ending. Something had arrived that would stir the dust he tried so hard to settle. And standing before him was the one who carried that change. An Apache tied to a past he barely understood and a future he never asked for. The envelope trembled slightly between his fingers as he turned it over. Sensing the force of whatever waited inside, the traveler took one step closer, eyes fixed on him, and said only one sentence. A sentence that made Hawk's heart pound in a way it hadn't in years. They said his life was about to shift, and nothing on that land would ever stay the same. And with that, the sky darkened, the wind rose, and Hawk realized the lonely life he built was no longer his to claim. Hawk didn't open the envelope right away. His fingers hovered over the seal, but something in him held back. Too many years alone had sharpened his instincts. And right now, every instinct warned him that whatever rested inside would tear open a part of his life he had locked away. The Apache traveler stood quiet, hands resting at their sides, showing neither impatience nor fear. They seemed to understand the weight of the moment, as if they had delivered such news before. But Hawk could tell by the stillness in their eyes that this task meant something different to them too. He motioned toward the porch, offering shelter from the rising wind. The traveler stepped up, their boots brushing dirt from the wooden boards. Hawk noticed how they carried themselves, poised like someone who had lived through storms harsher than anything the plains could throw. The beads woven into their hair shifted with a soft clatter, telling stories of places Hawk had never seen, tribes he had only heard of from distant whispers. Though calm, there was strength in their silence, the kind carried by those who understood the land in deeper ways than most settlers ever would. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped against the stone hearth. Hawk lit a lantern, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of the room. The traveler studied the walls lined with tools and old saddle gear, their eyes pausing on a faded photograph tucked into the corner of a shelf. Hawk felt heat rise in his chest. He hadn't meant for anyone to see that picture. It had been hidden there so long that even he forgot it existed until now. The traveler didn't ask about it, though their gaze lingered in quiet understanding. Hawk cleared his throat, turning the envelope between his hands once more. He finally asked who sent them, but the traveler only repeated that the answer was written in the letter. It wasn't their place to explain. They had been given orders from an agency that handled cross-territory agreements, old treaties, and matters most people avoided for their own safety. Hawk knew enough about those agencies to understand. Trouble rode at their heels. Years back, during the border conflicts, he had been pulled into work he didn't talk about. Work involving negotiations, land disputes, and dangerous choices that still visited him in his sleep. He thought all of that was buried with the past, never to return to his lonely ranch. The idea that some forgotten piece of those days had found him again made his stomach knot. He asked the traveler their name. But instead of a name, they offered a title. They said people called them Falcon among their own. Hawk repeated it slowly, feeling the strength in it. Falcon nodded once, acknowledging it was enough for now. Something about the way they stood, unflinching despite being in a stranger's home far from their own people, made Hawk realize they had traveled a long, grueling road to reach him. No ordinary assignment would demand that kind of journey. Hawk poured warm water into a tin cup and handed it to Falcon. They accepted it with a slight bow of gratitude. The fire crackled between them, the flames painting soft shadows over Falcon's angular features. Hawk studied them in the quiet, noticing the exhaustion hidden beneath their steady posture. Whoever Falcon was, they hadn't slept well in days. He finally broke the seal on the envelope. A breath escaped him as he unfolded the paper and scanned the first lines. It was an official notice, stamped months before, referencing an old agreement registered under his name. Hawk squinted, trying to believe what he read. It claimed he had signed up for a mail order program, tied to cooperative land management between settlers and certain allied Apache groups. A program that arranged assistance, labor, and representation on borderline properties deemed high risk. Hawk shook his head. He had never signed anything like that. His name wasn't even written in his own handwriting, and yet the document looked official enough to fool a judge. He asked Falcon how long they had been sent, how long their stay was expected to be. Falcon answered that the assignment was indefinite until the matter, tied to Hawk's land, was resolved. Hawk closed the letter slowly. There was no mention of the specific matter. No explanation of what danger or responsibility the agency believed rested on his ranch. Falcon watched him, waiting for his reaction. Hawk felt the tension inside him thicken. Something wasn't right. If this were a simple misunderstanding, the agency would have sent a messenger, not a representative who crossed tribal lines and endured harsh trails. He asked Falcon why he had been chosen. Falcon replied that the letter held that answer too, but in a way Hawk needed time to understand. Hawk read further, his pulse slowing as he reached the end of the document. There was a note, short and vague, stating that a past event involving his ranch made him eligible for representation due to risks involving land disputes, inheritance claims, and unresolved tribal agreements. It hinted at something he had forgotten, or maybe something he had never been told. Hawk felt the edge of the paper tremble in his grip. He asked Falcon if they knew what event the letter referred to. Falcon hesitated for the first time since arriving. They said only that they knew pieces of the story, not the full truth. Their tribe had records of a land agreement involving Hawk's property, written long before Hawk ever set foot there. But the meaning of those records was still disputed among their elders. Falcon had been sent partly to learn the truth as well. Hawk leaned back, the weight of the cabin settling around him. He had bought this land from an old rancher who died not long after the sale. The man never mentioned any ties to Apache agreements. Hawk had assumed he was the first to settle, the first to stake claim. But the letter and Falcon's words told a different story, one that suggested the land wasn't as untouched as he once believed. Falcon asked to see the boundaries of the ranch the next morning. They said the plains held memory, and the land itself would reveal signs if they walked it. Hawk didn't know how to answer. He wasn't used to anyone questioning his property, let alone someone who carried the weight of tribal knowledge behind every word. But something in Falcon's voice held respect rather than challenge. They weren't there to fight him. They were there for a reason neither of them fully understood yet. The fire dimmed as the night grew deeper. Hawk noticed Falcon's shoulders drop slightly, as though the day's journey finally settled on them. He offered them the small guest cot near the hearth, the only extra space he had. Falcon accepted with a simple nod. They unrolled their bundle, revealing a blanket woven in patterns that reflected moonlight like water. Hawk watched as they lay down without complaint, their breathing steady, their eyes closing the moment their head touched the pillow. Hawk stood by the window long after, staring out at the dark plains. A storm gathered over the distant hills, lightning flickering behind heavy clouds. He wondered what the land was hiding, what truth lay buried beneath the grass and soil he had walked for years. And most of all, he wondered what tied Falcon to that truth. He turned back toward the fire, watching Falcon sleep. This stranger had brought more questions than answers. Their arrival threatened to unravel the quiet life he built. Yet something deeper stirred inside him, something he didn't want to name. It wasn't fear or anger. It felt almost like the first moment of a change long overdue. In the silence, Hawk folded the letter and set it on the table. Tomorrow he would walk the land with Falcon. Tomorrow he would learn what fate had decided to place at his door. But tonight, as the storm rolled closer, all he could do was listen to the wind drag its long fingers across the plains. Carrying secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to face, yet the land had chosen to speak at last. And Falcon's arrival was only the first sign. Hawk felt it in his bones. This was just the beginning, and whatever waited in the shadows of the coming days would test him in ways his years of solitude never had. Morning came with a low rumble of thunder, and a light rain that turned the dust to dark streaks across the yard. Hawk woke before first light, the way he always did, but the weight on his chest felt different that day. He lay still for a moment, listening to the soft breathing near the hearth. Falcon slept without moving, one hand resting near the knife strapped at their side now, the tribal blanket pulled up to their shoulders. Even in sleep, there was a readiness in their body, the kind that came from a life where danger could wake you faster than any sunrise. Hawk moved quietly, poured coffee, and stepped out on the porch. The sky was a gray curtain, the rain gentle but steady. His cattle blurred in the distance, dark shapes against a silver field. This had always been his world, a rancher alone with the land. Now, the letter on his table and the stranger inside his cabin told him that his world was not as simple as he wanted it to be. When he came back in, Falcon was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot with eyes clear and alert. They greeted him with a simple nod, the kind of greeting that said they were ready for whatever came next. Hawk handed them a mug, and Falcon wrapped their hands around it as if drawing warmth not only from the coffee, but from the act itself. People from different lands, different lives, sharing the same fire on a lonely ranch. It was not something Hawk ever expected. They rode out after a quick meal, Hawk on his bay and Falcon on a spare horse he rarely used. The animal tested Falcon at first, tossing its head, but Falcon's hands were steady on the reins. They spoke to the horse in a low tone in their own language, and the animal settled with a snort, accepting its new rider. Hawk watched that with quiet respect. A person who understood horses that way usually understood people and land just as deeply. They followed the fence line first. Hawk pointed out the boundaries as he knew them, the markers he had trusted for years. Falcon studied the posts and the lay of the land, eyes scanning not just the surface but something beneath it. They asked about the man Hawk bought the ranch from, the old rancher whose name had faded from town talk long ago. Hawk told them what little he knew. The man had been called judge by some, though nobody knew if he ever held a real judge's office. He had scars on his hands and a stiffness in his right leg. He kept a Bible by his bed, but cursed loud enough to shake the rafters when a steer broke loose. Falcon listened, asking small questions that seemed simple but touched deeper layers. Did Judge speak of fights with local bands? Did he ever mention deals with Apache leaders? Did he keep visitors from the border territories? Hawk realized he had never wondered much about the past before he arrived. The man was already old, already tired, already selling. Hawk had only seen opportunity. Where others saw a fading property, they reached a rise where the ground dipped into a shallow valley. Falcon asked Hawk to stop. They dismounted, boots sinking into soft earth. Falcon crouched down and brushed aside grass and loose stone. Hawk watched as they traced the soil with their fingers, following faint lines he never noticed, shapes that meant nothing to him. Falcon pointed to a row of stones half buried in the dirt, set out in a way that looked almost natural until you saw the pattern. They said that among their people, stones like these once marked boundaries of hunting grounds and water rights. They were old, older than Judge, older than Hawk, older even than the town that sat far behind them. The pattern did not match the fence line. It cut across Hawk's land in a long curve. Claiming a wide stretch for another purpose, Hawk felt something twist inside him. If those markers were real, if they still meant anything, then his ranch sat on land promised long ago. Land where agreements were made without his knowledge. Land his money might never have truly owned. The letter from the agency began to take on a darker meaning. Maybe they had not sent Falcon simply to help him. Maybe they sent Falcon to watch him, to decide whether he had a right to stay. Falcon stood and looked out over the valley. They said their elders spoke of a place like this, where an old camp once sat near a traveling creek. A camp that belonged to one extended family of their tribe, and the families linked to them by marriage and oath. The creek still twisted faintly, more a line of damp earth than a real stream now, but the shape of the ground matched the stories. Hawk had ridden over that spot 100 times, never knowing another history lay beneath his horse's hooves. As they walked, Falcon spoke more about their assignment. On paper, they were listed as a cooperative partner, a representative sent to protect tribal interests and help the rancher manage disputes, trade, and border tensions. But off paper, Falcon said there were other whispers. Some believed this land had been stolen twice, once from tribal families and once from a settler who was cheated near the end of his days. Others believed a hidden claim existed, tied to a child whose name never made it into the registry. The word child made Hawk frown. He asked what kind of claim a child could have on his ranch. Falcon hesitated, then revealed something that made the air between them tighten. There were rumors that Judge had once married into an Apache family in secret, that a union had been made during hard years when survival meant crossing old lines. A child had come from that union, but when times turned against such relations, the family was split by force. Judge returned to the town world. The other parent returned to the tribal world. The child was said to have vanished into the storm between them. If that story was true, then the ranch had been part of a bridge between two lives that never truly met. A bridge built on pain and hidden shame. Hawk's ownership might be linked to a broken promise neither side wanted to look at until now. Falcon admitted that elders disagreed over how much of the story was fact and how much was fear. But the agency seized on it anyway, sensing trouble and opportunity. They created the mail order program, locking Hawk's name to it without his true consent, and sent Falcon to stand in the middle. Hawk felt anger rise. Not at Falcon, but at those far away who thought they could move people like pieces on a board. He asked if Falcon had any choice in coming. Falcon answered plainly. They said they had been chosen because they were trusted to speak for their people, because they had no living family to be put at risk if matters turned violent, and because they had already walked both worlds, enough to understand a rancher's life and tribal law. That honesty struck Hawk harder than any insult. Here was someone thrown into the same storm he had not asked for. Two lives held by a paper neither of them believed was fair. The main conflict settled into place. It was not just about land. It was about who had the right to decide what that land meant. It was about whether two worlds could stand together on ground both felt had been taken from them. As the day wore on, they explored more corners of the ranch. Falcon pointed out more stone markers hidden beneath brush. Hawk showed them the spring where his cattle drank, the canyon where a flash flood once almost took his life, the high ridge where he sat alone at dusk when the weight inside grew too heavy. Falcon listened to every detail, treating his memories of the land with the same respect they gave their elders' stories. A subplot began to form in the quiet between them. Hawk found himself telling Falcon about the night he lost the only person he had ever thought of starting a family with. A woman from town with a brave laugh and a stubborn streak larger than any storm. She had died in a wagon accident on the very road Falcon traveled. Hawk blamed the land for years. Blamed fate. Blamed himself. It was part of why he chose solitude. If a man let no one into his life, he risked losing no one. Falcon listened without judgment. When he finished, they shared their own past. A brother taken by sickness when food ran thin. A father who walked into the mountains and never came back after being forced from ancestral hunting ground. A mother who taught them how to read both the wind and the letters on white men's pages, then faded from this world under the weight of too many losses. Falcon had grown up straddling hunger, tradition, and change, learning to carry grief without letting it harden their heart. Those stories did not resolve anything. They did not sign new agreements or clean old debts, but they built a strange bridge between Falcon and Hawk, a human bridge made of shared pain, quiet respect, and an understanding that both of them had been shaped by choices they did not make. The tension did not ease. If anything, it deepened because now they had more to lose if conflict turned sharp. Near sundown, they returned to the cabin. As they rode in, Hawk saw dust on the horizon. Not the drifting dust of cattle, but the straight rising trail of riders. His grip tightened on the reins. Visitors did not come often, and when they came unannounced in groups, trouble usually rode with them. Falcon followed his gaze. Their posture shifted, calm but ready. Hawk led the horses toward the corral, never taking his eyes off the incoming figures. He could already make out a few shapes. One looked like Deputy Cole from town, with his stiff hat and proud shoulders. Another rode with a swagger Hawk recognized as one of the local land grabbers, a man who had been circling like a vulture for years. Waiting for any sign of weakness. Between them rode a third figure, dressed too fine for the frontier. Coat pressed, papers tucked into a leather case, posture straight like someone used to desks in city offices. Hawk did not need much guessing to know what world that man came from. He smelled agency trouble before the riders even slowed. Falcon stood beside Hawk as the horses drew near. Two different worlds, side by side, watching a new wave of conflict roll toward them across the plains. Hawk felt the letter's weight again, even though it lay on the table inside. Falcon rested one hand lightly on the hilt of their knife, not as a threat, but as a simple truth about the world they both lived in. The riders reined in and dust drifted around them. The man in the fine coat lifted his chin and scanned the ranch with sharp eyes. Pausing on Falcon, then on Hawk, the wind dropped, leaving a silence thick enough to cut. Whatever awaited them in the words that man carried would not be simple, and it would not be kind. The three riders stopped just a few paces from Hawk's porch, their horses tossing dust into the fading light. The man in the fine coat adjusted his gloves and gave a tight smile that carried no warmth. Hawk didn't return it. Falcon stood beside him, quiet as stone, their presence creating a calm line of strength between Hawk and whatever storm these men had brought with them. The deputy dipped his hat, but even that gesture felt stiff, forced by duty rather than respect. The third man, the land grabber known as Kessler, looked around with hungry eyes, taking in the barns, the grazing fields, and every piece of earth as if he had already decided it would someday belong to him. The man in the coat introduced himself as Thatcher, a representative from the territorial agency. His voice had the tone of someone who believed titles carried more weight than truth. He said he had come because concerns had been raised over Hawk's property, concerns tied to old agreements and new claims filed in the last month. Hawk's jaw clenched. He asked who filed those claims, but Thatcher avoided the question. Flipping open his leather case instead, Falcon watched every movement. Hawk could feel them reading Thatcher the way a hunter reads wind and shadows. When Thatcher finally pulled out a set of papers, he handed them forward with a flourish, as though expecting Hawk to fall apart just from touching them. Hawk didn't take them at first. He asked again who filed the claims. This time Thatcher's smile slipped. He said the claims were filed on behalf of tribal interests, but the agency also noted a competing settler claim filed by Kessler, who now sat on his horse with a grin that made Hawk's stomach tighten. Falcon stepped forward then, not aggressively, but with a calm authority that made Thatcher's horse shift nervously. Falcon said their people had filed no new claims. If any papers had been submitted under tribal authority, they were forged or twisted by someone trying to sow conflict. Thatcher hesitated. The deputy looked down at his reins. Kessler's smug grin grew sharper, as if watching the first spark of a fire he hoped would burn the whole ranch down. Hawk finally snatched the papers from Thatcher's hand. He scanned the pages, feeling heat crawl up his spine. The documents claim that the original ownership of the land had never been properly transferred from the family tied to the old Apache agreement the agency hinted at in the letter. It listed descriptions of property lines Hawk never knew existed, drawn from maps older than any state border. And at the bottom, in bold letters, the papers declared that until the dispute was settled, the agency had the right to place the land under temporary management. Management, the word hit him like a hammer. It meant they could freeze his rights, move his cattle, restrict access to water, and worst of all, it meant Kessler or someone like him could use the agency's hesitation to chip away at the ranch until there was nothing left to fight for. Falcon took the papers from Hawk's hand and read them with a slow, steady breath. When they looked up, their eyes were sharper than Hawk had ever seen. They said these documents carried pieces of tribal language, but twisted, taken out of context, repurposed by someone who wanted the land, not the truth. Falcon stated firmly that no Apache leader had signed anything resembling this claim. Kessler finally spoke then. He slid off his horse and stepped closer, his boots sinking into Hawk's soil as if he owned it already. He said the land was too large for one man to manage and too valuable to rest in uncertainty. He said the best outcome was to let the agency divide it fairly. He even suggested that Hawk accept a bill before the fight got ugly. Falcon shifted at Hawk's side, their jaw tightening. Hawk felt anger ignite in his chest, slow and deep. Thatcher cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. He said the agency intended to review the land within the next week. During that time, Hawk was expected to cooperate with Falcon as their representative. Thatcher added that Falcon's presence would help determine if the tribal claims held any truth. His tone made clear he doubted Falcon's reports before Falcon even made them. Falcon stepped closer to Thatcher, stopping at a respectful distance, but the force in their voice carried across the yard. They told him the tribe would not be spoken for by paperwork forged by outsiders. They said the land held memory, and they would find the truth before the agency twisted it further. Thatcher looked unsettled. The deputy shifted in his saddle, clearly wanting no part in what was unfolding. Hawk asked Thatcher what the agency planned to do if both claims were proven false. Thatcher didn't answer directly. He said only that in such a case, the land might be deemed unsettled territory and reassigned by the territorial committee. Kessler's smile widened at those words. Hawk felt the ground beneath him tilt. This wasn't just about old agreements. Someone wanted him out. Someone wanted this ranch torn from both tribal history and Hawk's hands. Falcon turned to Hawk then. Their voice was low but firm. They said the land must be walked again, deeper this time. They needed to search for signs older than the stone markers, signs that would show whether the ancient agreements were binding or broken. Hawk nodded, though his heart hammered. Thatcher mounted his horse again, announcing that he would return within days to gather Falcon's findings. Kessler lingered a moment longer, his gaze sliding to the cabin, the barns, and the horses, as if already imagining himself claiming them. As the riders left, the wind shifted, carrying dust and tension across the yard. Falcon stood unmoving until the riders disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did they speak. They said the agency would not wait long. The conflict would tighten quickly, and if they didn't find proof to counter the documents, the ranch would fall into federal hands. Where men like Kessler could twist the law to their advantage, Hawk felt something heavy settle on him, thicker than the storm clouds gathering overhead. For years, the ranch had been all he had left. Now strangers with polished boots and clever lies threatened to take it from him. Falcon placed a hand on the fence, their eyes sweeping across the horizon. They said that land remembers truth, and if the truth belonged to Hawk, it would reveal itself. But they also warned that not all truths were painless. Some might shake Hawk's understanding of the ranch, the judge, and the hidden legacy tied to this soil. They spent the next day walking deeper into the west side of the property, where the land grew wilder. The grass thickened around their boots. The creek bed twisted through the earth in shapes that whispered of old pathways. Hawk pointed out areas he rarely visited, places where cattle wandered but where he had never lingered long. Falcon stopped near a cluster of rocks arranged in a crescent. At first it looked random, but Falcon knelt and brushed away leaves and dirt, revealing carvings weathered by time. They traced the symbols, their expression shifting into something Hawk couldn't read. Falcon said the markings belonged to a particular family line within the tribe, a line tied to the stories of the old union between Judge and the Apache woman. The carvings hinted that a child born of that union was meant to inherit certain rights, not material wealth but guardianship responsibilities. Hawk felt his pulse thicken. He asked Falcon if that meant the child still lived. Falcon said they didn't know. Some stories said the child was taken away. Others claimed the child died young. A few whispered that the child grew up hidden, never knowing the weight of the blood they carried. But one thing was certain. If the child had lived into adulthood and had descendants, the land might legally belong to them unless they had chosen to relinquish their rights. That thought struck Hawk deeper than he wanted to admit. He had spent years believing he was alone in the world. But if the Judge had left behind a lost bloodline, then someone out there shared a connection to this land stronger than any deed. Falcon studied Hawk quietly, as though sensing the storm inside him. They placed a hand gently on the carved stones. They said the land would not reveal everything in one day. But the signs were growing. And the deeper they searched, the more it seemed as though someone had tried to bury the real history long before Hawk ever arrived. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the plains, Hawk and Falcon returned to the cabin. Exhaustion weighed on them, but the tension remained sharp. Falcon set the carved illustrations they traced on the table, comparing them to the strange symbols on Thatcher's papers. With every comparison, the truth became clearer. The agency papers didn't match the original tribal markings. Someone had manipulated the documents, twisting the symbols to fit a false narrative, but before they could study further, a thundering knock rattled the cabin door. Hawk and Falcon exchanged a tense look. No rider traveled this late unless something urgent or dangerous pushed them. Hawk stepped toward the door, heart pounding. Falcon's presence steady at his side. When Hawk opened the door, he found a young rider from town, breathless, mud-splattered, and gripping a torn letter. He said Thatcher had been seen talking to out-of-territory men known for land seizures. Men who didn't care about tribal rights or settler rights. Men who only cared about profit and control. The rider said those men were planning to reach Hawk's ranch by morning. Falcon stood still, but their eyes sparked with fire. Hawk felt the world tighten around him, pushing him toward a moment he couldn't avoid. And as the wind surged across the plains, the ranch that had stood quiet for years felt ready to explode into the fight that would decide its future. Hawk stood frozen for a long moment, the young rider's warning hanging heavy in the cabin air. Falcon stepped forward first. They placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder and told him he had done the right thing by bringing the message. Hawk poured him water, letting him catch his breath, and the rider explained everything he knew. Thatcher had been seen in a saloon on the far edge of town, talking with a group of out-of-territory men who were known for forcing ranchers off their land through pressure, forged papers, and intimidation. These men were already riding toward Hawk's ranch under the claim that agency authority gave them the right to inspect the property. Falcon listened with narrowed eyes. Hawk felt anger rise in him, but beneath it was something steadier: resolve. He had lived alone for years, but he would not let the ranch fall to men who valued only profit. Falcon asked the rider to stay the night for safety. The boy agreed, exhaustion pulling at him. Hawk stepped outside, looking across the plains as twilight dimmed. This land had shaped him, challenged him, broken him, and rebuilt him. He felt a rush of quiet strength now, knowing he was not facing this alone. Falcon stood beside him, shoulders squared and calm, their presence grounding him like the earth beneath his boots. At dawn, Hawk saddled his horse and Falcon prepared their bow and knife. They rode out to meet the approaching men before they reached the house. The sun pushed over the horizon, painting the grass gold. A few hundred yards from the ranch's edge, the riders appeared, 6 of them, rough-looking men with sharp eyes and hands too eager to rest on their holsters. Their leader rode ahead, a broad man with a scar cutting across his jaw. He lifted a paper Thatcher had given him and claimed they were here for a property inspection. Hawk told him plainly that no inspection would be done without proper authority. Falcon stepped forward, introducing themselves as the tribal representative acknowledged by the agency itself. The leader laughed, dismissing tribal involvement as nothing more than old stories. Falcon's gaze did not waver. They spoke with calm conviction, describing the carved stones, the ancient boundaries, and the forged symbols hidden in the agency's documents. Their voice carried across the field with unwavering clarity. The men shifted uneasily. Not expecting an Apache to speak with such knowledge and strength, the leader tried to press forward, but Hawk blocked the path with his horse. He told the man that the land was tied not just to history, but to truth, and no outsider would decide its fate through false claims. The leader reached for his weapon, but before the tension could explode, the thunder of hooves echoed across the plains. Hawk turned to see the deputy riding hard toward them, followed by 2 town elders and a second agency officer. Hawk had never met. They had come after learning Thatcher's dealings were suspicious. They had reviewed the tribal registry Falcon had referenced and compared it to the claims Thatcher submitted. What they found confirmed Falcon's suspicions. Thatcher had altered documents, forged signatures, and manipulated land records to benefit Kessler and these hired men. The officer announced Thatcher was being taken into custody for fraud. The deputy turned to the out-of-territory group and told them to leave immediately or face arrest. The leader glared, but he knew when odds turned against him. With a final threat muttered under his breath, he signaled his men to withdraw. Their horses kicked dust as they retreated across the plains, leaving Hawk, Falcon, and the deputy standing in the early morning light. Hawk felt the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time in days. The agency officer apologized for the trouble caused and asked Falcon to present their findings in town so the rightful boundaries could be confirmed. Falcon agreed, but insisted the ancient markings be respected in the final decision. The officer nodded, recognizing Falcon's authority and insight. The deputy offered Hawk a quiet smile. He said he always believed Hawk deserved better than the loneliness he wrapped himself in. Back at the cabin, Falcon and Hawk prepared to ride into town for the hearing. The young rider watched them go with admiration, sensing something significant had shifted. In town, people gathered, curious about the conflict. Falcon stood before the council, describing the land's true history, the old union between Judge and an Apache woman, and the child who might have been the rightful heir. The elders listened carefully. Hawk felt his chest tighten when Falcon explained that no clear record of the child's survival existed. The council concluded that without proof of a living descendant, and with the forged documents thrown out, the ranch belonged to Hawk free and clear. The decision settled like sunlight through clouds. People clapped. Falcon bowed their heads slightly, not in humility, but in respect for the truth restored. Hawk thanked the council, but his eyes lingered on Falcon, who stood strong and calm, their presence shaping the moment more than anyone else's words. When they returned to the ranch, the land felt different, as if it breathed easier. Hawk walked with Falcon to the carved stones once more. Falcon traced the markings gently, speaking of the family who once camped there. The stories passed through generations and the child who vanished into history. Hawk felt a strange ache, wondering who that child might have become, and whether they ever knew this land the way he grew to know it. Falcon placed their hand on his arm, telling him that honoring the past did not mean surrendering the present. The ranch now lived in his care, and through him, the land would carry both histories forward. Days turned peaceful again. Hawk repaired a fence damaged during the storm. Falcon helped him move a herd closer to fresh water. Their partnership settled into a natural rhythm. Hawk found himself speaking more, the quiet walls inside him loosening. Falcon spoke of their people's traditions, their travels, and the wisdom they carried from a mother who taught them to read wind and earth. Hawk realized he was learning again, not just about land, but about connection, trust, and the quiet strength of letting someone stand beside him. One evening, as the sun blazed orange across the sky, Falcon stood beside Hawk at the ridge overlooking the ranch. They said their assignment was technically complete now that the conflict was resolved. The agency had cleared him. The tribe had no further claims. Falcon could return to their people. But the way they looked at the plains told Hawk there was more in their words than duty. Falcon admitted something quietly. They said they felt a sense of peace on Hawk's land, the kind they hadn't known since losing their family. They said Hawk treated the land with respect many settlers never learned. They also said they believed the ranch had called them here for a reason beyond the dispute, a reason tied to healing both Hawk's and their own. Hawk felt a warmth rise through his chest. He told Falcon they were welcome to stay, not as a representative or guardian, but as someone who belonged. Falcon didn't answer right away. They stepped closer, resting their hand on his, letting the silence speak its own truth. They said they would stay, not because duty demanded it, but because the land felt complete with both of them standing on it. The ranch grew brighter in the days that followed. Hawk no longer woke to emptiness. Falcon's presence filled the quiet spaces, bringing understanding, purpose, and a sense of home he hadn't known he needed. Together they strengthened the ranch, rebuilt old corners, and walked the land with new appreciation. The carved stones remained untouched, a tribute to the past, while fresh fence lines marked the ranch Hawk and Falcon shaped together. In time, people in town spoke not of Hawk living alone, but of Hawk and Falcon running the ranch with strength and honor. They spoke of how Falcon bridged two worlds, bringing peace where conflict once lived. They spoke of the ranch as a place where history and hope lived side by side. And Hawk, who once believed his life was set in quiet solitude, found something far greater. He found partnership. He found connection. He found a future where two strong spirits worked the land together, honoring the stories beneath their feet and building new ones that spoke of unity, healing, and a ranch saved not by ownership, but by truth. The land no longer felt empty. It felt alive. And for Hawk, that was the greatest ending he could have asked for.